Jeskins. I'm the facilitator or coordinator for the Bay Area ASCAC Lecture Committee. Tonight's guest is a brother whom I admire very much, and he's actually a mentor of mine. Most of you know him for his outstanding and pioneering work in the African presence in Asia and the Pacific Islands. But tonight, he will do something a little different for us. The Africans called Moors. Brother Runoko has a long bio, and in the interest of time, I won't go through all of it. Maybe we can have some time afterwards, and I can talk about him. If that's okay with you, Brother Runoko? Fine. Okay. So, without any further ado, brothers and sisters, would you please stand and give a warm, welcoming applause for Brother Runoko Rashidi.
That's all right. Okay, I'm set. Hope that, brothers and sisters. Peace. Good evening. I'm very pleased to be here once again in at Wosay Community Church, and I'm particularly grateful to ASCAC or the local ASCAC study group for inviting me to come up here. I'm especially grateful to Brother Naeem, who's worked very hard to put this together, and so far, and I'm sure will continue to be the rest of the weekend, a wonderful host. I think the local ASCAC group and Brother Naeem in particular deserve a round of applause. It's very important to acknowledge that, because if you're not involved, you don't know how hard it is to put together a program like that. Whether you be a student or you're working in the community, in the academic community, whatever the case may be. I hadn't planned to really say that, but just looking at all the energy that goes into it, it is important to acknowledge that, because sometimes people get tired, even if you are very, very committed. You need that kind of reinforcement. You not only need a round of applause, but we need that kind of working unity, so that this becomes not just a lecture occasionally on a Saturday evening, but it in fact becomes a way of life. That this is the sort of thing that we talk about on a regular basis, that we incorporate in our curriculums. We make sure that it's on television, and we don't confine it to a lecture or a seminar or a conference or the shortest, coldest month of the year, February. We are people with the most to talk about historically. In fact, for most of the history of the world, that humanity is only African or black people. Europeans, as we know it, even the first Europeans were black. But Europeans, as we know them today, only come into Caucasoid people, white people, that European. Has only been in existence 25,000 years. And then you find what would appear to be a prototype Far East Asians, according to the works of Sheikh Antiquity, only come into being about 15,000 years ago. That all modern humanity emerges out of Africa beginning about 100,000 years ago and spreads to the far corners of the earth. This is based on studies, genetic studies, from Bosnia-Herzegovina to the Bay Area. All modern human beings come out of Africa and move into the other parts of the world, where they begin to lose, you might say, some of those original Africoid characteristics, that Africoid phenotype. And in places like Europe, beginning about 40 to 50,000 years ago, and that process continuing until about 25,000 years ago, you do have Ice Age kinds of conditions that take place periodically. And those original Africoid people, spawned by a black mother on the continent that some people have dubbed Eve, begin to transform themselves physically, because your environment is different. Instead of the equatorial environment that you would have encountered in Africa that would have molded your physical type, you would, because of these Ice Age conditions, you would probably have to retreat in many cases into the caves of Europe, And so your pigment would become much lessened. You become much lighter. I think there's a relationship, too, between vitamin D. I don't pretend to be a biologist. Your nose would probably go thinner and longer so that you're not breathing in that cold Arctic air that would freeze your lungs. I would guess the hair on your body would even begin to grow differently and maybe grow longer to cover you like a mat. It's things like this that produce the variations in what are called the human race. There's only one race, the human race, of which the black type is the oldest and most original. There's no doubt about that. Now, I hadn't planned to say any of that, but it seemed like a good way to get started, because tonight we are going to focus largely on the Moors, and the Moors, of course, are most distinguished because of what has been labeled here their conquest of Europe. And that's what we're going to put the bulk of our attention to. By the way, I was talking to my good friend Paris Williams a moment or two ago, and she had not seen this flyer before. Did most of you get a copy of this? If you didn't get a copy, you should ask the brothers and sisters in ASCAC Forward. This is a classic flyer. You know, over the last 10 years or so, I've probably given at least 300 or 400 lectures. And the last few years in particular, I really tend to focus on some of the literature that gets passed out. Sometimes, you know, they don't spell your name right, or there's something that's misspelled. This is a magnificent flyer. And this person right here probably personifies the Moors more than any representative that I can think of. And of course, this is the black Saint Maurice. Saint Maurice, for a long time, was the patron saint of the Roman Empire. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about. Is everybody with me so far? All right. Now, I'm going to do probably the first 30 or 40 minutes in the form of a lecture. It's a little later than we had anticipated. And then probably about 30 minutes worth of slides, and then hopefully we'll have a chance for some questions and answers. Now, tonight's presentation is on the Moors in Antiquity, and much of this research was published in... Thank you. Most of this research that I'll be talking about was published in this particular book, The Golden Age of the Moor, which comes out of Rutgers University, and of course is edited by my friend and colleague, mentor, Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who we all know, and whose research we greatly admire. Now, about 2.5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, Van Sertima began to say, well, Rashidi, let's start planning what the future issues of the Journal of African Civilizations are going to be. And he says, well, you know, after we talked for about an hour, he called me back the next day and he says, well, forget all that. Let's do a book on the Moors. And I didn't think that there was enough material available from an African-centric perspective to really do a comprehensive book on the Moors. In fact, the only major piece that I could think of, which was certainly not African-centered or African-centric, was the work by Stanley Lane Poole, which is, I think, called The Story of the Moors in Spain. It was originally published in I think, 1887, and it was reprinted in about 1990 with a new foreword or preface by the great African-centric scholar John G. Jackson in Chicago. But we began to assemble this information, and we were able to, as an assistant editor, I say we, with the Journal of African Civilizations, we began to accumulate more than enough information. And so it's a lot of that I'm going to be talking about tonight. In fact, James Brunson and I, probably my closest research associate and somebody who has done magnificent work, we were able to put together enough information and in an impressive enough fashion so that it in fact became the first chapter in the book. And in addition to that, I also had an opportunity to, as an emissary, you might say, for the Journal of African Civilizations, to go to Chicago and go to a nursing home at 3311 South Michigan Avenue and do an interview with John G. Jackson, you know, who is in very poor health. So that is a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. It's very important to say those things. It's very important to acknowledge ASCAC and those people who are working to put these things together. It's very important to acknowledge the people who are involved in the struggle on many different levels. Now I'm getting involved in the research because it is important to point out that this is a collective effort, that we all have a responsibility to pursue this and to implement it. Thought, and Kwame Nkrumah used to say that thought without practice is empty, and I think action without thought is blind. That we have to become scholar activists, okay, and that all of us play a very important role in that. Our ancient Kemetic ancestors used to say ignorance is evil. Over here we say ignorance is bliss. Don't tell me I don't want to know. Why? Because with knowledge comes responsibility. Not just me, not Paris, not Manu Ampen, not Brother Naeem, but all of us have a responsibility to take this information and disseminate it. We are not ego-tripping. We are not talking about getting lost in the past. We are talking about reconstructing the past. We're talking about rewriting not African history, because African history is just the missing pages in world history. We're talking about rewriting history from the very beginning. And in order to rewrite history, or the purpose of rewriting history and reconstructing the past, is so that we can construct the future. If you are not familiar with your past, if you lose the past, your future becomes a brittle thing, easily broken, says the Chinese proverb. And that is essentially what we're talking about. We are not talking about ego-tripping or self-glorification, although rebuilding our self-esteem is very critical. We're talking about looking into the past, going over the whole book, looking at the role of people of color, especially black folks, looking at the role of women who have been systematically written out of the history book, so that it in fact becomes his story. Or as Napoleon Bonaparte said, a fable agreed upon. And that includes Kemet. Of course, the Nile Valley is a centerpiece. And then we look and see how African civilization, or monumental high cultures, by which I mean scripts or written languages, agricultural science, that we have the ability to feed ourselves. This develops first in Africa. And isn't it ironic when you look at the Sudan and Somalia? You know that there are some parts of Somalia where there are no children? All the children are dead. And this is where agricultural science originated. A key element of civilization. We've lost that to a significant extent. Other aspects of monumental high culture would be metallurgy, metal weapons and tools, agricultural science, and urbanization, that people live in villages, towns, and cities. This is what I mean. These are the rudimentary elements of civilization. And they develop in the Nile Valley to a large extent, and they begin to spread to other parts of Africa. And we would want to trace and document that spread into Asia, and trace the spread of African civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, in the Yangtze Valley in China, along the Indus River Valley in South Asia, and then begin to show how that same civilization even diffused into Europe, to be able to talk about how the first civilization in Europe is not Greece at all, but is actually a civilization in the Aegean Sea that we call Minoan Crete. And the people of Minoan Crete apparently were refugees, Africans coming from Libya and also northern Africa. And they dominated the Mediterranean and southern Europe for a long time before anybody ever heard of a Greece or a Hellas. To even be able to talk about that influence in terms of Rome, etc., an African element there, and then certainly to be able to trace the influence and the spread and presence of African people in the Americas before Colombo, okay? Before 1492. Some people would say before Christ. I simply say before the Christian era. But of course, another very important element that we need to look at too, particularly because of its impact on modern civilization, and that is the Moors. But before we get to the Moors question in Europe, or the Moors' presence in Europe, let's look at the Moors historically. Now, the first time we hear about a people called the Moors, as far as I know, based on my limited research, is around the 4th century BCE. More or less about that period of time. And they are mentioned as a people in North Africa. And I think generally the term is not Moor, but it's a term of which Moor is a derivative of, but that term would be Maros or Mari. I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly, but you spell it, Mari would be spelled M-A-U-R-E. And I think Moros is M-A-U-R-O-S. And that term means scorched. And this applies to a particular group of people in northwest Africa. We find the people known as the Moors or Mores, if you want documentation for that, by the way. Perhaps the best book that covers, shows what how the ancients applied that term is a book by a very confused brother, a brilliant scholar, but a confused African. And that is Frank Snowden, the author of this book, Blacks in Antiquity, the Greco-Roman Experience. Now, they are mentioned specifically as militarists. And eventually we are to find them fighting with the Carthaginians, or the people of Carthagis, and I'll illustrate that when I begin to get to the slides. Now, Carthagis or Carthage, the term Carthagis means new town, was founded in 814 years before the Christian era in northern Africa, in parts of the country that today we would call Algeria and Tunisia. It, over a period of time, becomes a vast commercial empire. It was founded by a group of people that we call the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are, after the people of Minoan Crete, they become the great sea lords of antiquity. And their fleets, their merchant fleets, dominate the Middle Sea, or what we call the Mediterranean Sea, what the people of Kemet or Egypt call the Great Green. Eventually, from a city called Tyre, Tyre, in 814 BCE, these people moved to North Africa. They were largely heavily black folks by our definitions today. And they blend in with the indigenous North African population, and that produces the empire or the city, the nation of Carthage. Now, the Carthaginians are in the western Mediterranean. By the way, the term Phoenician, that's where we derive the word phonics from, because the Phoenicians are credited with introducing the first kind of international alphabet. Okay. And they are the brothers, or the coastal branch of the people that we call the Canaanites, who, of course, in the book of Genesis in the Bible are identified as one of the four sons of Ham, the brother of Ethiopia or Cush. Ethiopia is another Greek word which simply means the land of the burnt-faced people. In the Bible, the Hebrews would refer to them as the Cushites. And of course, the other brothers of Ham would be Phut, which is identified with Libya sometimes, and Somalia at other times, and then of course Mizraim or Kemet. So you have the Canaanites, and the Phoenicians are a coastal branch of the Canaanites. A coastal branch of the Canaanites. So they move into northwest Africa. They begin to blend in the small colony with the indigenous northwest African population. And they produce the Empire of Carthage. The Carthaginians developed their empire, but over a period of time, shortly thereafter, the new rising power, the new boy on the block, becomes the Roman Empire. And Rome and Carthage are not far from each other, and they begin to become very competitive, with the Romans seizing the initiative and beginning to try to push the Carthaginians out of their position of dominance, which they eventually do in three massive wars called the Punic Wars. Punic coming from phonics or phoenix or Phoenician. By the way, the term phoenix is apparently a Greek word and apparently means something like ruddy or reddish. And we assume they were talking about the complexion of the people. The Moors are fighting with the Carthaginians against the Romans. And apparently they're great warriors. Most of them form a kind of a cavalry. Hannibal Barca, the most distinguished of all the Carthaginians that we know of, lost his only major battle in Europe when his Moorish allies were no longer there in support. By the way, the family of Hannibal Barca were known as the Lion's Brood. These were some rough Africans. And they swore undying hatred to the Roman Empire because the Romans were trying to wipe them out. In fact, supposedly when Hannibal was like 9 or 13, he swore undying hatred to the Roman Empire. Reminds me of a Native American that we call Crazy Horse, the Lala brother. When Hannibal was about 21, he was sworn in, he was voted commander-in-chief of the Carthaginian military. And they fought the Romans tooth and nail for a long time. And Hannibal succeeded in achieving one great victory after the other. But eventually, through massive manpower, largely on the part of the Romans, they were defeated. The Romans came up with two generals who planned the ultimate defeat of Hannibal, by the way, and their name, interestingly enough, was Scipio Africanus. Now, I'm not sure if they were, and by the way, that should tell you that the name of Africa does not come from Leo Africanus. Some people have asked that, because the Romans are using that name at least 1,000 years before Leo Africanus. I'm not saying that they were African. It could be that they got the name because of their conquest of Africa. But certainly that is interesting, and for people looking for research projects, that might be one of them. I'm not seeing anybody do any work on Scipio Africanus, this great, great general who eventually defeated the Carthaginians. How did he do that? Because he said we couldn't defeat Hannibal in Rome, or at the outskirts of Rome. We have to go to Africa. And they cut off Hannibal's supply. They divided the Africans amongst themselves. Familiar story, isn't it? You have one group of Africans called the Numidians, along with the Moors and the Carthaginians who are fighting together. And Scipio Africanus is able to place a wedge between these forces and fragments them, and they're defeated. It happens every time. By the way, Numidian, that's where we get the word nomad from. And these are North African horse soldiers. Eventually, with the fall of Carthage, Rome becomes a dominant power in North Africa. And yet the Carthaginians, I should say the Moors, continue to play a very important role. Now, one of the things, I was reviewing a lot of documents to prepare for this lecture, and one of the most interesting things I came across was an article, once again, sent to me by James Brunson. And you have many, many Moors who fought after the Carthaginians fell. The Moors switched their allegiance, and as mercenaries, they began to fight with the Romans. Okay? Now, after a tour of duty of about 25 years, you became a Roman citizen automatically, and you are settled in a particular part of the Roman Empire. Some people might be settled in Germany. Some people might be settled in the area called Gaul. But interestingly enough, you have a lot of these Africans who are settled in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Yeah. Now, this is from a publication called Croatia, Land, People, and Culture, edited by somebody named Francis H. Eterovich. And in a section beginning on page 383, he has a section called The Roman Colonization of Moors in the Balkans and in other regions of Europe. Let me just read a bit of this. Most of the Serbs living in Bosnia and Herzegovina today have a strikingly dark complexion. This was published in 1970. Inherited from the Balkan Vlachs, and he spells it V-L-A-C-H-A-S, of the Middle Ages. All historians agree that the Vlachs were not ethnically Slavic. In the Middle Ages, they spoke their own language, derived in large part from Latin. Historians disagree, however, on how they came into possession of their dark brownish complexions, or rather, on which black or semi-black race these Vlachs descended from. It says, in my own study, which is called The Origin of the Vlachs, V-L-A-C-H-S, published in 1956, I have proved that the medieval Vlachs were the descendants of Moors who lived in Mauritania in northwest Africa. As war veterans, they were settled by the Romans along the Danube and the Balkans and in other regions in Europe. It goes on to say that the Roman army was composed of mercenaries who for the most part came from Dalmatia, Gaul, and Mauritania. And then last but not least, he says that the Moors in the Balkans, he says that Moors were settled in the Balkans during the reign of the Emperor Claudius and continued to do so until the fall of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476. He says, from this document, we may deduce that at the beginning of the 5th century, at least 100,000 descendants of Moors lived in the area which is the present-day Balkans. Writing about the settlement of the Bulgarians in AD 681, the old Croatian chronicles mention the Mal blacks under the name of the Black Latins. The black people will be in the thick of it everywhere you find them. Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, Next, I think I would like to mention briefly the fact that the Moors are very significant. They, once again, are in North Africa, and they distinguish themselves once again, as militarists, although they are to eventually lose this battle. And this is the battle for the control of Northwest Africa as the Arabs begin to invade the continent. Now, and I will talk quite a bit about the African presence in Arabia before this is over. But let me just say that beginning, I think, in 639 or 640, the Arabs, under the banner of Islam, march into Egypt, and they quickly conquer Egypt, which is very momentous. I believe that the man who was in command of the Arab army was a black man, and the man who gave the keys of surrender to Alexandria was also black. So Egypt is defeated very quickly, and rapidly in the 7th century, the Arab armies proceed across northern Africa. They move through Libya very quickly, and eventually they get to the countries that we would call Mauritania, but mostly Algeria. And there they are met with the fiercest resistance there to encounter in all of North Africa. And this is in the 7th century, and this resistance is led by an African woman, interestingly enough, a woman who is called El Kahina, which means the prophetess. We don't know much about this sister, but the descriptions that I get of her seem to indicate that she had dreadlocks and very dark skin. And she is regarded as a prophetess. She apparently would go into a kind of a spell, and she was able to really inspire her troops, into fierce resistance. It is said, in fact, that she engaged in a scorched earth policy and kept the Arabs at bay for a long time. Unfortunately, over a period of time, her army fragmented, and the Arabs under Musa, under a man named Musa, eventually conquered this part of Africa. And according to John Henry Clark, who will be here, I think, on December the 11th or 12th, somebody that you really ought to see, one of our great master griots, master historians, and somebody I consider a real mentor. He says that this is the most, thus ended the most desperate, the fiercest resistance in antiquity at that time to keep Africa for the Africans, and this is led by a woman. The women are to play very important roles in Moorish history, not only in terms of their conquest of Europe, but also in Africa itself. There's another record of a black Moorish woman written in an ancient document that portrays her as the head of a group of so-called Amazons, and she was supposed to be the greatest archer of her time. I really want to emphasize once again the role or the fact that we are in this together. And when we're looking at history, not only are we amazed by how much African history, how much the history of black folks is left out, but specifically the role of African women. And no matter where we find them, their role is very significant. Now, let's deal directly with the African movement into Europe itself, or the movement of the Moors. The first time we find the Moors moving into Europe after Hannibal as an independent movement is around 170 AD. And apparently they make a small excursion into the country that today we would call Spain. But certainly they make their biggest impact after the fall of Kahina. And some accounts say that she was beheaded and her sons converted to Islam. I don't know how accurate that is, but the Moors convert to Islam. They join the triumphant surge of Islam, and they quickly cross into the Iberian Peninsula, where their remarkable feats and swift victories soon became the substance of legends. Now, the first probe into Iberia, and if I'll use 3 or 4 terms, I'll try to be consistent, but I may use Iberia, and if I use Iberia or the Iberian Peninsula, it's too bad we don't have a map. We should have had a map. Then we'll be talking about Spain and Portugal. Sometimes it is referred to as Al-Andalus. That is an Arabic term that applies to that same area. Sometimes Europeans might call it Andalusia, or we might simply use the word Spain and Portugal. The first probe into that part of Europe during the Islamic phase of Moorish history begins in August 710, and it is led by a man known as Tarif, T-A-R-I-F. He leads 400 men into Iberia, into Spain, on a mere reconnaissance mission. Apparently, I think there were like 300 horsemen and 100 infantry. They have a successful reconnaissance. Their idea is to just go and have a probe to see what kind of fighting forces, to see what the political conditions are in Spain for possible conquest, or at least a major raid. Apparently he was successful, and a small city or port is named after him. That is Tarifa, T-A-R-I-F-A, and that's where we get the word tariff from this African, or Moor. But the major movement is to come sometime in the next year, and that is, of course, led by the great General Tariq, T-A-R-I-K. Tariq is to become known as the first great general of Western Islam, the sword arm of Islam. This is a great, great warrior. We don't know a lot about him. Musa, this Arab governor of Northwest Africa, or the Arab who commanded the conquest of Northwest Africa, makes Tariq the governor of much of what we call Mauritania. And I think in June or July 7/11, they crossed the straits, once again a narrow strip of water that separates Africa from Europe. And they stop on a rocky promontory that from that day since has borne his name, and that is Jabal Tariq, or what we call Gibraltar. Now once again an African. Now Dr. Yusuf A. Ibn Yaqinin, who has done significant studies on the Moors, even tells me that the man who led the movement across the water, who actually brought the Africans across this narrow strip, was known as Admir. And he says this is where we get the Spanish word admiral from. All of this is in the 8th century. These are black men, Muslims, imbued with a degree of almost religious fanaticism, where they are determined to spread the teachings of Islam. Now, Tariq had a relatively small force. How am I doing so far? Everything okay? I'm kind of quiet out there. I took my glasses off. I can't hardly see. I'm hoping everything is going good. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm glad we have a turnout. All right? Tariq leads 10,000 men across the straits of Gibraltar. And mostly they're Berber. We're going to deal with the word Berber in a little while. They're mostly Arab, not Arab, forgive me, I'm really tripping now. You got a few Arabs. And that kind of shows the confusion too. Because the Greeks and the Romans called these people Moors or Moros. The Arabs called them Berbers. And then when they get to Europe, the white Spanish Christians will call them either Moors or Saracens. Okay? And then you have Moor civilization, which is a composite of all of that. And that is why the Moors are confusing. When I was giving the introduction, and I was going around the world, and I talked about the various civilizations, it is important to look at the Moors because they are in many ways like the Egyptians were perhaps 50 years ago, before a lot of our attention was focused on them. And people were able to claim that there was a mythical white Egyptian race. You know, ain't no such thing as a white Egyptian in antiquity. That's a myth. All right? You can show me one, bring him here. All right? Well, the Moors are similar to that. All right? We haven't really looked at the Moors critically. In fact, most people really don't acknowledge the Moors at all, probably for two reasons. First, because they were black to a large extent, and secondly, because this most recent phase of Western civilization, with a caveat and quotation marks and brackets underlined in boldface, Western civilization. Somebody asked Mohandas Gandhi once, what do you think of Western civilization? And Gandhi pondered for a minute and he says, I think it would be a very good idea. Because they were black and also because they were Muslims. And the people who conquered them, being Christian and white, I think automatically put them into the closet, put them on the back burner. So it's important to look at them again. Now, but it's confusing. And we have to do a lot of deciphering. And we have to do a lot of research to really get to the core. As Manu Oppen would say, primary research. Now, we're in Spain with Tariq in July 7/11. And he has a force of about 10,000 Moors and maybe 300 or 400 Arab propagandists, it is said. And he is confronting an army led by a man known as King Roderick. Roderick was the last king of the Visigoths. And the Visigoths was the ruling white Spanish Christian element that was in power at that time. Remember now, Spain has been, it's a very ancient land. Obviously, geographically. You have many people that have been there. You have African movements into Spain going back as far as 1,000 years before the Christian era. And you have an expedition led by the great Taharqa of the 25th Kushite, Nubian, or Kemetic dynasty. And then you have Moors that go there in 170. You have the movements of Hannibal. In fact, some people would say that Hannibal's father, a member of the Barca family. I said this is a suggestion now, I'm not saying the fact, that actually even founded the city of Barcelona. And then you have Roman movements. You have other white people who come through. Right? So you have kind of a hodgepodge. So Roderick is leading the largely white Spanish Christian army, although we will even show you black people in that army that were fighting against the black Moors, black Spanish Christians fighting against the Moors. Leads an army of 70,000 men, a massive army, and Tariq has 10,000 men, perhaps 10,500. And supposedly a great battle is to be joined. And Tariq is alleged to have roused his troops more or less with the following words, "My brothers." And this is quoted by Edward Gibbon in the book, the 3-volume set, The Masterwork in the 18th Century, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, or The Rise and Decline of the Roman Empire. He says, "My brothers, the enemy is before you, the sea is behind you. There's nowhere to run. Follow your general, for I am determined to achieve victory and to trample on the prostrate body of the Roman Empire, of the Roman Emperor." And they jacked the Visigoths up. This was a paramount victory over 70,000 troops. Tariq must have been awesome. And he didn't sit to relish his victory. He raced on with a seemingly tireless Berber or Moorish cavalry to the city of Toledo, conquered that, where he was joined by Musa. And together they conquered most of the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, only stopping in southern France at a place called Tours, T-O-U-R-S. If not for that, then perhaps all of Europe would have been Islamic today. They were stopped in 732 by a man that we know as Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer. This is the grandfather of Carolingian dynasty's finest representative, and that is Charlemagne, who we'll return to shortly. Now, once the initial Moorish conquest had been achieved, you have a movement of so-called Arabs into Spain, led by Musa. And once again, Musa is the head. I'm going to pick it up. Musa is the head of the Arab armies that had ordered the conquest of Northwest Africa. Now, although the Africans had achieved the greatest victories, they were given the least rewards. They were given the worst allotments of land, and they were treated, no doubt about it, in a second-class manner. Tariq himself is reported to have been publicly rebuked and is struck by a whip by Musa. The head of the Islamic world heard about it and called both of them to a meeting in Damascus, where it was Musa who was publicly rebuked and humiliated. All his money was taken away from him, and I think he was forced to live as a penniless beggar the rest of his life. Whereas Tariq, at the conclusion of an illustrious military career, went to the Far East, we are told, to spread the teachings of Islam. Tariq should be the subject of a book. We should know about who this great African general was. Now, after the conquest, the initial conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, Moors by the thousands flooded over. In fact, some are said to have been so anxious to get there that they are said to have floated over on tree trunks. And brothers were trying to get there. And so you have a fundamental, a massive movement of black people into Spain as Muslims beginning in the 8th century. In the 10th century, the movement intensifies. You have the first dynasty, which is called the Umayyad dynasty, and then they are followed by another dynasty into Spain, two other black dynasties, the Almoravids, led by Yusuf I, who was from Senegal. You know, that's how far the Moorish Empire extended, and Yusuf, by the way, is described as being brown-skinned with woolly hair. His empire, the Almoravid Empire, is so large that it extends from the Senegal River in Africa all the way to the river Ebro in Spain, and it is called the Empire of the Two Shores. Yusuf reminds me of Pianki or Pi in the Nile Valley. He's a very pious man. He does not come to conquer. He comes at the invitation of the Moorish princes in Spain, who are squabbling amongst themselves and allowing the white Spanish Christians to begin to exert so much pressure that they cannot maintain themselves. And so Yusuf is invited to come over in the name of Islam and more solidarity, to come and once again keep the white Spanish Christians at bay, which he does. And as soon as he leaves, the Moorish princes begin to squabble amongst themselves again, and they eventually, a few years later, ask him to come again. He says, all right now. And in fact, he comes. And then the same thing happens again. This time he comes as a conqueror. And he establishes what's called the Almoravid dynasty. And then about 50 years later, 100 years later, you have the last great dynasty, and that is called the Almohad dynasty. Almohad. Almoravid is spelled Almoravid, and Almohad Almohades. And then there's one more, eventually a minor dynasty, an African dynasty called the Marinid dynasty, M-A-R-I-D. Now, the Moors, one of the problems with the Moorish occupation in Spain is that they do not leave a lot of visual representations. Perhaps because of religious beliefs at that time, they did not believe, I think this is accurate, they did not believe in portraying what the human form, and as a result of that, most of the depictions that we have of the Moors is that of their enemies, the white Spanish Christians, who refer to them consistently in many documents as black. Black as a cooking pot, black as tar, black as pitch. They refer to them as the cold-faced ones, to the extent that the word Moor, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, the Moors as early as the Middle Ages and as late as the 17th century were commonly supposed to be black or very swarthy, and hence the word was often used for Negro. So by the 16th century, in fact, you know that's inaccurate. I'm reading that directly from the encyclopedia, because at that time there was no such thing as a Negro. But it was often used for a black person. You see what I'm saying? Now, I've been studying this for 20 years. And I'm caught up in it. We all have a white supremacist, a Klan member walking around in our head, because he's been planted there. And the field and white supremacy extends into academia. It extends into all governmental and state institutions. And we have to wipe that out. You know, as long as I've been studying this, and I've been to digress for a moment to try to make it real, I began to pursue this about 1972 very actively. And since about 1981, this is like all I do. I quit my job. You know, I stay at home most of the time in front of a computer. Parents will tell you it's hard to get me out studying. And when I'm not doing that, I'm lecturing, I'm out traveling, trying to get some information. Do you know, all the books, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of books that I've referenced, it was only a few years ago that I could see black people in my mind as the Egyptians. I could see Nefertiti up there. I could see Cleopatra. That's how deeply entrenched this is. We say all the time that we have to begin to do this for the children, to put it in the schools. But we also need a cadre of old folks who have this information that can take it and walk with it. Okay? And the Moors are a very key component in that. Now, other people have not had, let me just present some information in terms of the Moors and the black thing. Let me quote a couple people. It says, for example, during the European Renaissance, explorers, writers, and scholars began to apply the word During the European Renaissance, explorers, writers, and scholars began to apply the term Moor to blacks in general. A prominent example of this tendency can be found in the work of Richard Hakluyt, Hakluyt. This is a prominent 15th century traveler. Hakluyt recorded that in old times the people of Africa were called Ethiops and Negritos, or Negriti, which we now call Moors, Moors, and Negroes. In the Romance languages, Spanish, French, and Italian, the first time I read that, it bothered me, because I had heard of the Romance languages. And I thought the Romance languages, meant amore and love. That just means the language of the Romans. In the Romance languages, Spanish, French, and Italian of medieval Europe, Moor was translated as Moro, Moir, and Moor. Derivatives of the word Moor may be found even today in these same languages. In Spanish, for example, the word for blackberry is mora, a noun which originally meant Moorish woman. Also in Spanish, the adjective for dark complexion, which now means brunette, is moreno. We have a similar legacy in the French language. In French, moricard means dark skin or blackamoor, while morena means black grape. Again, as in the Spanish, the Italian word Moor means Negro or Moorish female. Also in Italian, Moor means blackberry, while Moriola means black olive. So there should be no doubt about who the Moors were. Shakespeare uses the word Moor and African interchangeably. And once again, by the 13th or 14th century, the word Moor was more or less a synonym for African or black. Now, two of the Moors that are perhaps the most outstanding representations for their influence on Europe, two individuals, would be Saint Maurice and Sir Morion. Now, Saint Maurice is also known as the Knight of the Holy Lands. And Maurice, in a nutshell, just to briefly talk about a story and not to read, Maurice is identified in a document by a guy named Eucharius, who was the Bishop of Lyon, I think around 450 years into the Christian era. And he points out that Maurice was a duke or a count who lived in the Thebaid region of Egypt. This is the center of Egypt, and that at this point this was a strong point for Christianity. And he was the commander of a legion of African soldiers who were under the employ of Rome, and they amounted to 6,600 men. And they were ordered to a place that the Romans called Gaul, which would have incorporated parts of Switzerland and Germany, and they were sent there to suppress an uprising of these rebellious Roman subjects. Now, when Maurice gets there, he finds out that these people that are involved in the uprising are also Christian. And he decides that he cannot fight fellow Christians. Now, he refuses his orders. He refuses to obey the commands of the Roman emperor, who I think was Maximian at that time. And Maximian, when he hears about this, is furious. And he goes directly to the spot, and he orders, personally, Maurice to suppress the uprising, which Maurice once again refuses. So he begins to have 10 men at a time, all in the Theban legion, beheaded, thinking that this will eventually pressure Maurice to obey the orders, and he does not. Eventually, Maurice himself is beheaded, refusing to renounce his religion, to obey his orders, and to worship the gods of the Romans, whoever they may have been at that time. Now, about 100 years later, Maurice becomes a martyr. And the cult of St. Maurice begins to spread throughout Western and Central Europe, along the Rhine, in France, in Burgundy, in various parts of Germany. By the 8th century, by the time that the Moors are moving into Spain, the cult of St. Maurice is reaching immense proportions. I told you about I mentioned Charlemagne, who is a grandson of Charles Martel. Charlemagne is from a dynasty called the Carolingian dynasty, and he is probably the most important European of his time. He carried the lance of St. Maurice into battle. He had the lance of St. Maurice, which was supposed to be a replica, believed to be a replica of the lance that pierced the side of Christ, identified with this black military saint carried before the army. In addition to that, Maurice has a banner, a special banner. This banner is so important that whenever the Central Europeans, like the Germans, go into battle in the East against the Slavs, they carry the banner of St. Maurice before the army. St. Maurice, it is said, and this I find remarkable, it is not until 1240 AD that Maurice is identified as or portrayed as black, which is very odd to me because the name Maurice means like a Moor, and Moor literally is black. To be Moor is meant to be black, but by this time you have Maurice clearly identified as a black person. In fact, I think this is one of the first and earliest distinct images of Maurice. I don't have this on a slide, so let me just talk about this briefly. This piece right here was constructed in the year 1240 in a cathedral in a place called Magdeburg, Germany. And what it shows is a black man, a knight, a clear and distinct black knight in a full suit of armor, life-size, with red lips, black skin, etc. This is not a figment of anybody's imagination. This is a real live person. And for about the next 300 to 400 years, Maurice is to become the dominant patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire, a black saint. By the 14th century, his cult was rivaled only by St. Michael and St. George. And even today, in parts of Eastern Europe, the cult of St. Maurice is still alive. This is a black saint. In the 14th century, you even have a cathedral built to St. Maurice in Lithuania. And you can still, I'm told, go there and see the evidence of this cathedral, which is surrounded by the heads of what is called blackamoors. You also have Sir Morion. Most people have probably not heard of Sir Morion. Sir Morion is in fact a black knight who is the second, after Maurice, the second dominant Moorish figure in medieval Christendom. Now, once again, the Moors distinguish themselves largely as Muslims, but the Moors they're not a religious group, it's an ethnic group. And some of them become Christians. Some of them are Christians and Muslims all at the same time. Some elements are Christian, some are Muslim, etc. Now, Sir Morion is probably a Christian convert who comes from Spain. And this is documented in a book simply called Morion, M-O-R-I-E-N, which is a metrical romance. It was originally written in French and later in Dutch. And it was translated in 1901 by a guy named Jesse L. Weston. I don't know the publishing house. Morion is a metrical romance, and it's the adventure of a splendidly heroic European knight. And to hear the story, or as the story goes, as it begins, it involves the Knights of the Round Table. And Morion, who is gigantic, rides up on a huge horse, and he's cut up, and he's bloody, and he's about to fall off the horse. And he rides up, and there are the Knights of the Round Table, like a boys' club, hanging out, right? And Sir Gawain, Sir Lancelot, whoever the rest of them were. Galahad. And here's this great black knight, and he's all cut up, and he falls off his horse, and they ask him to tell his story. Who are you, brother? How'd you get here? What's the deal? We want to hear about it. At any rate, not in those exact words, but to paraphrase it, that's what they were more or less asking the brother. So anyway, Morian is on a quest. And apparently what had happened was his father, before Morian was born, was on his way to the Crusades. On the way, he met and fell in love with Morian's mother, got her pregnant, and then left. Right? Now, Morian's mother was disgraced as a result of that. And when Morian became of age, he went looking for his father, wanting a few explanations, like, why haven't we seen you? And not only do I want to hear the story, but I want you to come back with me, explain it to my mother, her family, and then everybody else in the city. Because my mother has lived under this cloud. This is in the story. So he's on a quest to find his father, which he eventually does. And he forces him to go back. He's all apologies. He says, hey, man, one of those things. So he once again, he didn't use those exact words, but in the interest of time, he takes him back, and he explains, and in the process, Morian meets all the Knights of the Round Table and becomes the ultimate, the personification of Christian knighthood. He becomes the finest knight in Europe. He saves Sir Gawain's life. He's articulate, and he's consistently described as black. Black as pitch. Black as ink. The only thing white about him was his teeth. Black as a crow. And this is Sir Morian. Now, when we hear about black knights, we tend to think that's a myth. But you do have very, very important figures in terms of Christianity with the Black Saint Maurice. There's a book with that same title, The Black Saint Maurice. You can find him in this book, other book, The Image of the Black and Western Art, Volume 2. They have magnificent photographs, full color photographs of a clear and distinct black saint. And then we also have Sir Morian. Now, Sir Morian, the fact that he impacts with the Knights of the Round Table, which is supposed to be in merry old England, once again begins to show the diffusion of the Moors, the diffusion of African people, and this is the key thing, not as slaves, but as masters in control of his and her own destinies. Though I always never failed to say that the one thing that really propelled me, that really made me want to look at antiquity, and to call myself, if I can, a historian, which I have worked very diligently at for many years now, is the fact that I found out with something which may be very simple to you, something you might take for granted. It was certainly nothing that I took for granted, is that we actually went places in ancient times without shackles and chains. I couldn't believe that, because I had grown up with the notion that African history began in a remote African jungle, or began in a cotton patch in Kentucky, right? That we had no history of noble stature that was independent in and of a European. As though we waited in a dark room for a white person to come into that room and turn on the light. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it took a while. In fact, if anything, just the opposite of that were the case. But that is not the way history is generally taught in the Western world. In the Americas, we are taught that history begins largely, and I'm speaking generally, and I'm oversimplifying things. But sometimes you have to do that, because we're also talking about another kind of scholarship. Talking about approaching history in another light. I think that our history is generally perceived to begin with Christopher Columbus and the catastrophe, the Holocaust that he unleashed in the Western Hemisphere with Pizarro and Cortez and the rest of those boys, Balboa. And then in the East, quite often we would look and we would begin our real analysis of history with Marco Polo in China. And of course, in Africa, it would begin with the Greeks, particularly with Alexander the Greek. Alexander, by the way, who was fascinated by Africa, who had great respect, from all I could gather, and I have no reason to defend him, who had great respect for Africa, to the extent that he requested that he be buried in Africa. Usually when you die, you want your body sent back home. So even in Vietnam, talking about getting the remains of POWs, you want your remains back home. Alexander wanted to be buried in Africa, and in fact he eventually was. By the way, it is said that so many Greek scholars studied in Africa, particularly Egypt. I think it was Demosthenes or Democritus who was supposed to have said, if I had a book of 1,000 pages, I would not have room to write the names of all the Greek scholars who studied in Africa. It is though our image now has been just the reverse of that history begins, in fact, with white folks somewhere. And it couldn't begin with people of color anywhere. So that was really what moved me. And that is, I think, perhaps a key element of what we might call an African-centric perspective, is that we do not dwell on the slave experience. All people have had that experience, but with African people, that is the primary focus. It is said, and I've even been told, there's no point looking toward the past. You don't have a past except for slavery. Of course, that person probably didn't tell anybody else that. We also, well, I mean, that's typical. You know, there's a book, Brother Naeem and I were talking about it earlier, called What They Didn't Teach You in History Class. And they have a whole string of quotes about what prominent scholars have had to say about African history or lack of. Arnold Toynbee, for example, is supposed to have said of all the 21 major civilizations that have been created, the African race has not played a part in any one. James Henry Breasted, one of the finest Egyptologists of all time, points out that the African has no inkling of civilization. As recently as the 1960s and 70s, Hugh Trevor Roper in England, who I think was one of Van Sertima's instructors, is quoted as saying, a student asked him once, Professor Roper, why don't we learn the history of black Africa? And he says, because there is no history of black Africa. There is simply none to teach. There's only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. See? He needs to be right there, in the front row. Now, Mauryan shows the diffusion of not only black people in Europe, but particularly the diffusion of the Moors. By 1492, Christian pressure from the Moors had become irresistible. Now, the Moors dominated southern Spain for close to 800 years. But eventually, more and more, over a long period of time, the white Spanish Christians began to put pressure on the Moors, and eventually by 1492, they had the last Moorish stronghold surrounded. And that is in a place called Cordova, and is specifically in a place called the Alhambra. But before I get to that concluding chapter on the Moors, let me, if I may, just read a little bit about the level of Moorish civilization and why they're important. Now, I'm quoting here from John G. Jackson. And he says that the Spanish city of Cordova in the 10th century was very much like a modern city. Its streets were well paved and there were raised sidewalks for pedestrians. At night, one could walk for 10 miles by the light of lamps, flanked by an uninterrupted extent of buildings. This was hundreds of years before there was a paved street in Paris, France, or a street light in London, England. The population of Cordova was over 1 million. There were 200,000 homes, 8,000 public schools, and many colleges and universities. Let me repeat that. There were 200,000 homes, 800 public schools, and many colleges and universities. Cordova possessed 10,000 palaces of the wealthy, besides many royal palaces surrounded by beautiful gardens. There were even 5,000 mills in Cordova at a time when there was not even one in the rest of Europe. There were also 900 public baths besides a large number of private ones at a time when the rest of Europe considered bathing as extremely sinful. If you ever go back in a time warp, just skip that. At a time when the rest of Europe considered bathing as extremely sinful and to be avoided as much as possible. Cordova was also graced by a system of over 4,000 public markets. He says the great Mosque of Cordova, another grand structure, had a scarlet and gold roof with 1,000 columns of marble. It was lit by more than 200 silver chandeliers containing more than 1,000 silver lamps burning perfumed oil. The golden age age of the Umayyad dynasty in Spain came during the 10th century. During the reigns of Abd al-Rahman and Hakam II, the Umayyad dynasty established sovereignty over the most substantial portion of the Iberian Peninsula. At the pinnacle of the Umayyad dynasty, this is somebody else now, the figures confirm Jackson. The great city of Cordoba possessed 200,000 residences, 600 mosques, 900 public baths that were patronized by all social classes. Among his many accomplishments, Hakam II added 27 schools for the free instruction of the poor. It should be pointed out that, at least during this period of Islamic Spain, girls as well as boys went to school, and numerous Moorish women became prominent in the literary and artistic field. Other Moorish women were involved in education, law, medicine, and library science. By 1492, the Christian pressures on the Moors grew irresistible, and on January 2nd, 1492, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain surrendered. This was in the Alhambra. And it is said, I was just reading an account a few days ago, that for 23 years, Ferdinand and Isabella, one being the queen and king of Aragon and Castile, had warred, and this was the culmination of the war. Finally, I think on the morning of January 2nd, 1492, the last Moors surrendered, and they were escorted out of the city. And a cheering throng, a mob of people cheered as Ferdinand and Isabella moved into the Alhambra. Christopher Colombo was among that crowd, among the cheering crowd. And within 3 months, I believe his expedition had been launched. Now, in January 2nd, 1492, the Moors are defeated in Spain. 3 months after that, the Jews are expelled from Spain, and in October 1492, Colombo is discovered in the Caribbean, and that can't be a coincidence. 1492 is to mark a fundamental turning point in world history, and much of it has to do with the final conquest, what these people call the world's longest liberation struggle, isn't that ironic, and their conquest of the Moors in Spain. Now, what happened to those Moors? Some of them stayed in Spain for a long time, where they were called Moriscos, or Little Moors. Eventually, by 1600, most of them had been expelled. I think in 1596, by a special decree, or 1496, the Moors were expelled from Portugal. Over 1 million Moors settled in in France, where their descendants were to exercise a tremendous impact. Other Moors went into the Netherlands. For example, there's a curious story of a black man named Swart Piet. Swart Piet this is in the Netherlands, in Holland. You know, Santa Claus has an assistant in Holland, and that is Swart Piet, or Black Peter. And by tradition, he supposedly was a Moorish orphan boy who Santa Claus trained and adopted as his assistant. Okay. You also have the Moors spreading to the very far east of Europe. In the 9th century, for example, the Moors laid siege to the city of Rome. In the farthest extensions, you have a person named Ibrahim Hannibal. He becomes known as the Moor of Peter the Great. Once again, by this time, many black people were known as Moors. And Peter the Great was the greatest czar on Russia during that period of time. This brother was so intelligent that he was sent to France as the godson of Peter the Great, or Peter the First. He received the finest education possible at that time. He received degrees in engineering. He became a general in the army. And this is the great maternal grandfather of Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, who is the father of Russian literature. Gorky and Tolstoy say that Pushkin was all things Russian. He was more than the Shakespeare of Russia. And the reason we don't know more about him is because his works, for some reason, do not effectively translate. But in the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, there are literally cities named after Pushkin, and they all identify him as black. Pushkin, when he died at the tender age of 37, defending his wife's honor in a duel, was working on a book, in fact, called The Moor of Peter the Great. And Pushkin gloried in his African ancestry. The Dumas family did not. The Dumas family, the great Afro-French, in fact, let me just digress for a moment and compare Pushkin, Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. If you want to read an excellent book on him, there's a piece by John Oliver Killens called Great Black Russian. John Oliver Killens is the same person that wrote Sippy and Youngblood. And he gloried in his African ancestry. Pushkin, in fact, is a fascinating figure. He was born, I think, on May 29, 1799, of well-to-do parents, members of the Russian aristocracy. When he was about 15 years old, he began to write his first books. When he was 17 years old, he had published books. And he was a brilliant poet, very swaggering, very arrogant. During his 20s, he was exiled because his literature was considered too revolutionary. And the kind of person that Pushkin was, he really seemed to thrive on attention. He would wear, for example, outlandish outfits. He might have a scarlet red turban with a canary yellow scarf and a stunning blue, vest and some white boots on, and then he would get mad if you noticed him, right? And he would challenge you to a duel. Eventually, he was defeated like that, but he was brilliant, and he was working at the end. Hey, don't ever say anything about him being African. That was enough to get you killed because he was regarded as an expert marksman. So eventually, he dies about the age of 38, and he gloried in his Africanness. Now, the Dumas family is just the opposite of that. You have first, I think it's maybe Thomas Davy Dumas, who was born in Santo Domingo in the 1700s, and he leaves Santo Domingo when he's 18. The next time we see him when he's 21, he is a major general in the French army. Very big man, and supposedly he was an idol, or Napoleon Bonaparte idolized him. Napoleon Bonaparte seemed to have a thing for black. His wife is a black woman, so-called Creole from the Caribbean. And Napoleon loved her to the extent that his dying words were Josephine, Josephine. According to Jay Rogers, he had 12 black generals in his army. In 1799 or 1798, he invades Egypt. So his life is surrounded by black folks one way or the other. And the elder Dumas was with Bonaparte in Egypt, by the way. And that is why they fell out. Supposedly because of Napoleon's destruction of Egyptian monuments. His son, Alexander Dumas Père, is probably the most prolific writer in relatively modern times. He supposedly wrote over 600 pieces. The Man in the Iron Mask, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Black Tulip, The Black Corsican, etc. But he didn't seem to acknowledge very much his African ancestry. He did say one thing that was very interesting. He said a man's mind is elevated by the status of the woman that he keeps company with. That is an interesting point. Van Sertima tells me that Dumas is our first known Egyptologist, that he in fact had written a book on Egyptology. And just as another side note, his son, the third Dumas, became the president of the French Academy of Sciences. That's 3 generations. That's deep. This is when slavery is going on. So you have Pushkin identifying himself as a Moor. You also have many Moors that venture into England. The best book on the subject is a work by David McRitchie called Ancient and Modern Britons. It was originally published in 1884. It was reprinted in 1985. It's subsequently been reprinted once or twice again. McRitchie, who was a Scottish anthropologist, born in 1851, died in 1925, seems to have gone crazy with black people in this book. And I wonder what could have possessed him. He writes about black Australoids, about black Huns. He writes about black Vikings. I don't know if you are aware of that. I don't know if that's a result of the spread of the Moors, but black Vikings. He talks about black people in Ireland. But the key of the book is the movement of Moors into the British Isles in ancient Britain. He talks about the Moorish influence on the music of Britain. By the way, the greatest musicians of that time were Moors, including one known as Zirab, or Z-I-R, I think Y-A-B, who was so bad he was simply called the Blackbird. This brother who invented the guitar, according to some people, was so significant as a musician that it is said when he was coming that the kings or governors or mayors of various cities would go meet him on the road. And he was called the Blackbird. McRitchie talks about the influence of Moors physically and culturally throughout the British Isles. For example, he talks about a man known as Kenneth the Niger, or sometimes known as Kenneth the Moor, a black man who was supposedly the head of 3 provinces in Scotland during the 10th century. And he traces their names. For example, his contention is, if you have a name like Moore or Morris or something to that effect in Britain, then you are somehow anciently connected to one of those movements of black folks that went there. He points out that in various islands in the British Isles, even during the 16th century, people still identified folks as having black skin or very dark skin. And this is something that most of us don't know about. Last but not least, I could possibly mention the fact that you have also what may be a Moorish presence in the traditions of Ireland. Ireland specifically mentions black people, possibly Moors, and they are identified as African sea rovers who raided the northwest, they call the Fomorians, and they raided the northwest coast of Ireland from a place called the Hebrides Islands. And apparently there was a struggle for who was going to actually control Ireland for a long period of time. You may have heard of the Black Irish. So many of these stories may well be connected with the movement of Moors into Spain and Portugal beginning in the 8th century, and then their diffusion and the ultimate spread of those Moors into France, into Germany. For example, Haydn, I think Joseph Haydn, who is the instructor of Beethoven, is usually referred to as the Moor. And according to J.A. Rogers, even Beethoven himself is sometimes called a blackamoor. You have Moorish people or Moorish families exercising a tremendous influence in the British royal families. For example, we may be able to trace the rise of Charlotte Sophia, who was the grandmother of Victoria, who was the wife of King George when the American Revolution was going on, a black woman, clear, distinct black woman, who the city of Charlotte, North Carolina is named after. So I could go on and on and on. If you have a name like Maurice, or Morehouse, or Morway, or Moretti, or Swartz, or Schwarzkopf, you are probably directly related somehow or another to those original Moors. And if you think I'm kidding with the term Schwarzkopf, when the Persian Gulf War was going on, somebody brought it to my attention. The name Schwarzkopf means black head. And if you look at J. Rogers' book, Nature Knows No Color Line, you can literally see these family crests from medieval Europe. Hundreds of them with black heads. And certainly you have 2 named Schwarzkopf with the emblem on the family crest being black. The head of a Moor. Somebody might want to write him a letter and tell him that. Now, that's it for the main part of my lecture. What I want to do now is try to illustrate some of these things in the form of a slide presentation, and we'll go from there. So now we want to turn the lights down, be really informal, and we'll take maybe a half hour and go through this. Is that too dark? I think it might be too dark. All right. How about that? Well, y'all just behave yourselves. Now, I'll try not only to illustrate briefly the Moorish presence in Europe, but I'll try to focus on African influence in European antiquity in general. Of course, this is the world's oldest known statue, the oldest statuette in Europe, and this is called the Venus of Willendorf. And I want you to take careful note of this piece. This was, at one time, on display right up here in San Francisco. And I think one of my first trips, or not to the Bay Area anyway, to Frisco, first research trip, which must have been about 80 or something like that. This piece was on display, or a replica of it. This is called the Venus of Willendorf. It's only 3 or 4 inches high, and I think it's either steatite or soapstone, and this is the oldest known identifiable statuette in Europe. It's approximately 30,000 years old. Now, I want you to look at the hairstyle. Some people would regard this as a fertility figure, an ancient goddess. But that would be a modern goddess right there. This would be a sister from the Andaman Islands. Now, it's my contention, and probably many others as well, this is probably not original. Once again, we're in this thing collectively. A lot of these slides, by the way, I'm going to show you, have been sent to me by people like James Brunson, Wayne Chandler, etc. Paris has submitted a number of things to me, or shared a number of things with me, which I'm very grateful for. And so let me acknowledge that you have probably a movement of people out of Africa beginning 100,000 years or so or more, and they in physical size would be small black people that we would call Batwa or something like that. Pygmies would be the more pejorative term. And they are the first people of the first world, small black lords of the earth. They spread all over the earth, and that would merely be an indication of that. This is a modern depiction of this same African physical type that we find in the Bay of Bengal in India, off the coast of India. And this is an ancient piece from Russia. This is about 14,500 years old. That fatty excess on the buttocks, that's called steatopygia, and obviously that's something that's characterized very much by African people. Now, this is Hannibal, or what we think to be Hannibal, the great warrior who led his troops from Northwest Africa into Europe, and of course among those troops were Moors, who formed a part of the cavalry. This is a Phoenician piece. This would be from the city of which the Carthaginians came from. Remember now I told you that Carthage was founded from a place called Tyre, the Phoenicians. This would be a Phoenician. And that's a beautiful piece. It looks very kinetic in appearance, and that's, probably for good reason. Once again, the people of Kemet and the people of the Phoenician city-states were very close as a whole. This is that piece of the Roman emperor, and this is a very rare piece. This is Septimius Severus. He is important because he's the most significant of at least 3 Roman emperors. He reigns from about 181 to about 197, 199 years after the Christian era. He is the last Roman emperor to die in bed for about 100 years. The rest of them were assassinated. He's directly from Africa. I don't know if he would be a Moor. Eventually he went back to Africa and he engaged in a triumphant homecoming tour. And for documentation of that, the most comprehensive documentation is a book called Septimius Severus, the African Emperor of Rome, by a guy named Anthony Burley, published by Doubleday, I think in 1970 or 1972. It's still in print. And it's not a very good piece. It seems like a light-skinned brother, but certainly there he is nevertheless. Here's another piece from that same period. And here's another one. These are black people that played critical roles in the Roman Empire. Of course, you have 3 African Roman emperors. You also have 3 African popes, Victor I, Miltiades, and Galasius. Now, Victor I is on the throne at the same time, not on the throne, but he's the pope. At the same time, it might be the same thing, at the same time that Septimius Severus is the Roman emperor. And you also have a black man, an African named Tertullian at that time, who was the most advanced theologian in the church. He's the one apparently who was responsible for Latin being the official language of the church for such a long time. So dig that. Even after the fall of Carthage, even after the fall of Kemet, you have an African emperor of Rome, you have an African pope, and a leading theologian in the world at that time, all Africans. Victor I, by the way, is important. One of his contributions is that he is responsible for for seeing to it that Easter is celebrated on Sunday every year. These are all black people. Now these are Moorish cavalry. Note the plated hairstyles. These would be typical of the folks that fought in what's called the Dacian Wars and who were settled in Eastern Europe and the Balkan states. This is a Moorish soldier. I think this is from the 2nd or 3rd century. These are all Brunson's pieces. These are all in the book. And don't forget the tapes, by the way. I think this is terracotta. This is another Moorish person in Spain in the 2nd century of the Common Era. This is Taharqa. Now, Taharqa is important in this story, not because he's a Moor, but because he also leads an expedition into Spain. And this is documented in Spanish chronicles of the period. He is mentioned as Turraco, or Turraco, T-R-R-A-C-O. And of course, we know him as Taharqa, the greatest king of the 25th dynasty. This is a tough brother, a great builder, a very pious man, under whose reign Kemet was stabilized for quite a long period of time in the 7th century before the Christian era. And here he is again, and here he is again. Now, this is a black Spanish Christian actually going into combat to fight the black Moors as they moved into Spain in the 8th century. And there's a detail. Very regally dressed. It has been argued, I should have gone into this before I turn the lights down, but let me just summarize it now, that the whole idea of knighthood and chivalry is even non-European. And I would think that's consistent. I just finished reading a book called The Kindness of Strangers, and it's literally about the abandonment of children in medieval Europe. That's not African. And the chivalrous notions that we find associated with Errol Flynn on Saturday afternoons on TV do not seem particularly European to me. The idea of honor and grace, in battle does not seem to be European. Now, some people would argue that this is derived from the legends or the works of a black man known as Antar or Antara, sometimes called Antar the Lion, who is the greatest figure of pre-Islamic South Arabia. He is a knight, he's a poet, and you can do a lot of documentation on Antar. By the way, in terms of Arabia, the first Arabians were black people. And even at the time of Muhammad, Arabia to a large extent is still relatively black. Muhammad's grandfather, Al-Mu'talib, is the most important man in Arabia, by the way, because he was the Sharif of Mecca. And it was his function, the function of him and his tribe known as the Quraysh, to guard the sacred Kaaba stone and meteorite. He fathered 10 sons, it is said by ancient accounts, each of whom was as black as the night and magnificent. One of them was Abdallah, who became the father of the Prophet Muhammad. In Arabia, at one time, things were very hot for the early Muslims. And Muhammad said, look to Africa, look to Ethiopia, go there, because you will find a king and a land of righteousness there. And these men greatly impressed, when they came back to Arabia, they greatly impressed Muhammad. And he saw fit to make the statement that he who brings an Ethiopian man or an Ethiopian woman into his house, a black man, a black woman, brings the blessings of God there. The law is so important, a black man, that he is identified as the third of the faith. You have the first Muslim to die in battle, a black man. And some of the earliest and greatest of the Muslims were black. And these are Arabs to a large extent. Now, this is a Moor in the back, along with an Arab. Moor civilization is confusing because while the term Moor means black, Moor civilization is not quite that simple. Once again, the Moors in Africa are called by the Arabs Berbers. In Europe, they're called Moors sometimes, and other times they're called Saracens. And then when it comes to Moor civilization, you have the mixture. You have the blacks and different groups of Moors, by the way, coming in at different times. Then you have Arabs and different groups of Arabs, with white Spanish Christians, with Jews, many of whom may have been black. I'll show you one in a moment. And the whole intermixture that takes place over 600 or 700 years. Moors. This is supposed to be a Moor and a Jew overseeing the conquest of the island of Majorca in 1469. Moors and Arabs and white Spanish Christians. Same thing. Now, what I'll do in the future, next time I come through Brunson, send me these. Now, see, this is the kind of person Runoko is. I just cut all that out and just have a close-up of the brother. Now, these are Moors laying siege to Palermo, Sicily. This is supposed to be a black Moorish giant, actually a Saracen giant. He's documented in a publication called the Song of Roland, a medieval epic. Gerald Massey argues that Stonehenge, this megalithic monument on the Salisbury Plain, 60 miles southwest of London, was actually constructed by black people, specifically by men known as Moorian. And according exactly, he says, now, as a Moorian, as a Negro is still known in English as a Moorian, may not the builder of Stonehenge may have been the Moorian, one of the great Cushite builders or something to that effect. And it's also been pointed out to me by an African that among the Lorma community in Liberia, the name Moorian is still very prominent. For a long time in the Dutch language, the word Moorian was used as a synonym for black African, so-called black African. Now this is a picture of St. Maurice, the black patron saint. St. Maurice was a military saint. Here he is again. I talked about the banner of St. Maurice that was taken into battle in the German crusades against the Slavs. St. Maurice on one side, and on the other side is St. George. You heard of St. George and the dragon. That's the dragon beneath George's feet. Now, most of us have heard about St. George. Most of us have heard about St. Michael or St. somebody or the other. But very few of us have heard about St. Maurice. Now, these are important too. I'll show you a series of black Madonnas in Europe that exist coincide with the depictions of St. Maurice. These are icons of medieval Christian Europe. Of course, they are the derivatives of Isis and Horus, the black Madonna and Child. Some of them, for example, the one I just showed you, I believe even have Isis and Horus carved on it. Or Aset and Heru, the African names. The name Aset or Isis means the throne. And of course, Heru was identified with the noonday sun, but here he is also in the form of the infant. The virgin birth, immaculate conception, is merely a story, an ancient African story, as repeated to Plutarch. Of course, this is Isis. Isis is the wife of Osiris, who was slain, his penis cut away, thrown into the Nile River, where it's swallowed by a catfish. No problem. Isis recovered the body, got everything but the penis, but prayed to the gods of Egypt to restore life back to the slain Osiris. And she, in that same form, while he's prostrate, she grows wings and flutters over the body and becomes pregnant. And that's where Horus comes from, or Heru. His whole function is to avenge his father's death. And he grows up and proceeds to do exactly that. He's got his uncle Set, who is his father's murderer, on the ground. He's about to kill him. And it is Isis who intervenes. Now, these are deep, deep, deep concepts that are to come forth in major world religions. But that's not what we're here for tonight. But let me just go through these because these exist at the same time as the black saints. And people might think in some cases that the St. Maurice is an isolated phenomenon, that this is a part of a wider concept of black religious icons in medieval Europe, and very important ones at that. The holiest icons in medieval Europe are regarded as these black Madonnas and Child. These are regarded as miracle workers, in fact. Before Napoleon's army was defeated by Kutuzov at the Battle of Borodino, I think in 1802, Kutuzov forced his troops to pray before Black Madonna. Before Joan of Arc launched her great crusade, she prayed before Black Madonna. When the first crusade was launched around 1200, it was launched in the French city of Luppe at the shrine of the Black Madonna. All over Spain, all over Italy, Portugal, France, Switzerland, Belgium, you name it, Black Madonnas figure very prominently. This is from Russia. Another one, beautiful piece. You know the old story about this, though, is that they really weren't black originally, that they turned black. And the reason they turned black is because of the smoke and soot from incense and candles. I always say that the smoke was very intelligent because it didn't accumulate on the clothes, it just got on the faces and the hands. And then some people would say, well, Rashidi, those are dark Madonnas, they're not black, because black people don't look like that. Well, black people range from snow to crow. And you have Ethiopians that look precisely like that. Of course, another theory is that many of them were originally much darker, and that they were so important as icons that they were literally taken into battle. For example, you could see this one with the cuts on her face. And those are sword cuts, because the icons were thought to bring big victory in battle. Many of them were destroyed, and eventually they would rebuild them or reconstruct them. But they may not have black models, so they would still make them dark. Many theories. Isn't that a beautiful piece? I think that's from Yugoslavia. I think. And also, consistently, once again, this is not, this is normal when it comes to depicting icons in early Europe. This is not a Madonna at all. This is a depiction, I just wanted to show this, of the Pallas Athena. Of course, Pallas Athena is the most important of the Greek goddesses, and here she is depicted in the black form. This is from southern Russia. This is about 2,000 years old. Pallas Athena is the most powerful of the Greek goddesses, and she is derived from an African goddess known as Nit, N-E-I-T, that we find distinguished in northern Africa, Kemet, as well as Libya. And this is from Persia. Now, why would I show this here? Because, once again, many of the, oftentimes, the Muslim populations in Spain, including the Moors, were indiscriminately known as Saracens. Now, three things about that. First of all, the word Sarah. Sarah is the wife of Abraham. And she's very prominent, which is not very typical of many women in Western Asia. In most of Western Asia and Asia in general, the woman, generally speaking, is seen as a mere extension of the male. India, of course, is a classic example of that, with the concept of the suti. Whereas when the head of the household died, the head of the household being lord and master, was the function of the high-caste Hindu widow to jump on the cremation fire and to take her own life so that she could continue to serve her husband and lord into the next life. That's the most extreme case. But in Western Asia, you have similar examples, but for some reason Sarah is very prominent, and she has a life of her own. I think that is typically African. Because in Africa you have a matrifocal society where the female is the basis. Once again, we talk a lot about Osiris or Asar, but the name Isis means the throne. That's the seat of power. In order to be the king in Egypt, you had to marry the royal female. And you have some cases where you have women who actually exercise full power. Now, Sarah seems to be typical of that, and that may be the basis of the word Saracen. This is supposed to be a depiction of her. And in addition to that, you have the word Kara, or Kara, K-A-R-A, which is the Turkish word that literally means black. Now, this is I don't know what we got here. This is either a black Madonna that is so black that it has a bluish tint, or this may be a Madonna just based on symbolism. And this is one of the reasons we have confusion. Things are really not so cut and dried and simple, but this is a beautiful piece. This is from Montserrat, once again back in Spain. This is a black knight. It may well be a depiction of Sir Muriel. This is from the 15th century in France. Once again, the story of Morian is derived from metrical romance. It was originally called the Lancelot. You have Moors who figure prominently in Welsh folktales. You have, for example, stories of Moorish boys encountered in Welsh folktales called the Mabinogion sitting playing chess, or Welsh giants. Or there's somebody called the Black Oppressor, and he's asked, why you call the Black Oppressor? It's because I've done justice to no one. Now, I think that these concepts show a prevalence of Moors or black people in the history of Britain and Western Europe, and it eventually begins to show them not as heroes, but as the defeated. And I think that's where the notion of the black knight comes into being. That whereas one time you have a prominent black or African presence, eventually with the defeat of these blacks, they become sinister forces in mythology and folktales. This is Mullah Ishmael. This is a great Moroccan or Moorish king. Many Moors also went back to Africa after they were expelled from Spain, and in many cases there to have dire consequences on African civilization. For example, you know that it was a group of Moors from Morocco with firearms who sacked the Songhai Empire and crushed it, I think, in 1596, or perhaps it was the 1600s, the greatest of the existing African empires, the heart of which was Timbuktu. And it is said that gold comes from the south, silver from the north, and salt from the land of the white men, but the treasures of God and the words of wisdom are only to be found in Timbuktu. That's an African proverb. Timbuktu is a university city. This is where the University of Sankara was located, where the ships were constructed apparently to launch the movement across the Atlantic by Abu Bakr II that had a profound impact on medieval American civilization. You know the story of Abu Bakr II, who had 2 fleets of ships constructed. He was a Muslim, but he was not interested in Mecca. He wanted to see what lay beyond the far sea. He was interested in more than a rare snapper sandwich. Right? He wanted to see what lay beyond the far sea. Isn't that the way it's projected? That African people had no interest in what lay beyond the sea. We were only interested in the sea as a means of sustenance. That kind of nonsense. Other people had a spirit of adventure. Africans didn't, for some reason. We stood still. We were engaged by inertia. Abu Bakr II has 2 expeditions launched, and he's never heard from again. So his nephew Mansa Musa becomes the king of Mali. At the center of the empire of Mali, Ghana, and Songhai was a great commercial city and university city of Timbuktu. And the major university was the University of Sankore, or Sankara, Sankore. Just give you an idea as to how important this city was, or this university, and how impressive it was. An African university that the Sultan, or the Askia of Songhai, died. And this is the largest empire perhaps in the world at that time. Very wealthy, and would have occupied an area about the size of the United States or Western Europe today. And you have 2 rival princes who want to be the king, who want to be the Sultan. It was a very wealthy empire, and one has an army and the other has an army, and they start from various sides of the empire, and they're going to meet at a predestined place, and whoever is victorious on the battlefield will become the Sultan of the world's wealthiest empire. At any rate, one of them on the way to the battlefield stopped at the University of Sankara at Timbuktu, and he asked the head chancellor, the African chancellor, to take him on a tour of the facilities, take him around, show him the library, introduce him to the faculty members, show him to take him into classes. This prince, this claimant for the greatest empire, the wealthiest empire in the world at that time, decided after his tour that he would ask the chancellor of the University of Sankara at Timbuktu to write a letter to his rival claimant, renouncing any claim to the throne, saying he really wanted to spend the rest of his life as a student in this city of books. That's impressive. African children need to know that. This is an indigenous woman from Algeria. This would be typical of a Moor. Once again, we don't have many reproductions of the Moors as they portray themselves in Antiquity. We mostly have things done by Christians, but this is a Moorish woman from modern Algeria. This is identified as a Moorish piece in pre-Columbian America about 900 years into the Christian era. Alexander von Wuthenau says this is Moorish. This is Ibrahim Hannibal. This is the maternal grandfather, great-grandfather of